Let's take a look at omnitrace-avail. Omnitrace-avail provides information on things called components, along with whether or not the component is available, some string identifiers for the components, along with descriptions, and some category classifications for each of these components. In addition to components, it provides information on settings, such as, say, the omnitrace config file option. You can see its current value, the data type that's expected, a description, and categories for the setting. Third, it provides information on the hardware counters that are available or not available, along with descriptions on what the hardware counter actually collects. You can see here we have a hardware counter that's identified by Poppy L1 DCM for data cache misses, which you can deduce from the description. You can see that it's available. You can see that the hardware counter for instruction cache misses is not available. Furthermore, there are quite a few hardware counters, as you can see here, and we will use those hardware counters later when we write our configuration file. Now, let's take a look at the settings that are specific to Omnitrace. Omnitrace has quite a few settings, but not all of them are directly related to the configuration of Omnitrace. Some of these settings pertain to configuration options within Timory. The options that we have here, specific to Omnitrace, can be viewed with the command line options -- categories Omnitrace. Okay. As you can see, this first option we have listed here is Omnitrace config file. We're going to write a configuration file with, and we're going to provide this through an environment variable, and we're going to use that configuration file to configure several of these other settings to provide us with a default config. Okay, we're going to put this in our current working directory, and we're just going to call it omnitrace config. By default, you can put the default settings that you want in this path right here, and always have those as the default, and you can override them later. The options we're going to particularly look at is we're going to specify a value for omnitrace debug. We are going to specify the output path, the output prefix, the Poppy events, and several others. Now, if you're curious what these options mean, you can pass in the option brief to suppress displaying the current value, and description to show you your description. Okay, and we can see that the setting omnitrace config is for a configuration file for Omnitrace. For the output path, we want to explicitly specify the output folder for results, and so on for the rest of these settings. Okay, I just wrote an Omnitrace config file that you see before you here. I specified the default value, omnitrace debug equals off. I set the verbosity equal to 0, which just provides a banner when Omnitrace starts, plus some basic information about output during finalization. I specified that I wanted the output path to be Omnitrace demo output. I set the output prefix to this special key called tag, which is the base name of the executable. I specified that I did not want the process identifier encoded into the output file name. I disabled time output. When you enable time input, when you enable time output, it creates a timestamped subdirectory for when the data was collected. So I disabled that. And then I enabled using Perfetto, and Perfetto enables detailed traces. And then I also enabled Temery, which enables high-level profiles. So when I run my application, I will get both detailed traces and high-level profiles. I further configured Temery to collect the wall clock time, the CPU clock time, the page residence set size, which is the memory allocated in the pages, or via pages, the CPU utilization, and I enabled Poppy. I specified that I do not want flat profiles, and I specified I do not want timeline profiles. I, by default, disabled call stack sampling, but I did enable thread sampling. So thread sampling enables system level data being collected in a background thread. I set the number of samples per second to 50, and I specified that for CPU related data, I only want to collect information about the first 8 CPUs. And up here, when I configured Poppy Vector, and in other places that collect hardware counters, I specified that the hardware counters that I wanted were cycles, instructions, and cache misses. Furthermore, when the target application uses HIP, I enabled using Rock Tracer, which traces the HIP API calls and the kernel runtimes. I enabled RockMSMI, which gives us device level data with regards to our GPUs. And then by default, I disabled extra labels for Cocos-based codes and OpenMP codes. And I also disabled data collection for generating the critical trace as a post-processing step. So now that we have that configuration file written, let's first look at omnitrace-avail. And we can see that, for example, omnitrace use Temery by default is equal to off. Okay, now let's set omnitrace config file to our configuration file in this folder that we just wrote. And now let's look at these values, and you can see that now that our omnitrace config file has been specified and it's been read in, you can see in omnitrace-avail that these values have now been changed to reflect the values that we specified in our configuration file. Environment variables override the values in configuration files. So as you can see from our last output and from the configuration, that omnitrace use Temery is equal to on. So if we actually specify that value in the environment and run omnitrace-avail again, you can see this value is once again false because the environment variable overrode the value in our configuration file.